Hello, and welcome to another episode of Close Mode, the enterprise sales show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, home of precision guided selling. And today, I'm more than legitimately excited to introduce you to Frank Cespedes. Frank was a managing partner of a professional services firm for 12 years. He sits on board of consumer goods, industrial products, services companies, PEs, VCs, author of 6 books. And in fact, here are two of my favorites of Frank's books right now. I'm going to talk a lot about how these influenced my thinking. Gartner called one of his books a must read. Forbes said perhaps the best sales book ever. That's quite a statement, Frank. Frank is also a senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School. With that introduction, Frank, welcome to the show.
Brian, thank you. It is really and truly a pleasure to be here. And I don't say that just because obviously that's the sort of thing you're supposed to say at the beginning of sessions like this. I mean it.
Thank you. Well, and today we're going to be talking about executing strategy at the deal level. And for our listeners, I was telling Frank this before the call, and on previous calls he and I have had that I read Aligning Strategy and Sales a while back, and it influenced my thinking so much so that this business Close Strong that we're building is highly tied to the problem that Frank sort of laid out in this book. So, I want to talk a little bit about this notion of connecting strategy and sales. One of my board members and advisors, Jim Dickey, said this to me about a year ago. He's like, companies make these strategic shifts. They might build the capabilities, marketing might build a deck, they announce it at SKO, and then on Monday, customers go back to buying the same way they bought last week. Sellers go back to selling the same way they sold last week. And again, like I said, this is the conduit that I've tried to build, is to make this connection. So we're going to talk about that, but I want to start high level, if that's okay. First, you said something to me last week about this thing of executing strategy at the deal level is more important. And you talked about the cost of capital and interest rates elevating the importance of this subject. So can we start there? Why has it made this more critical?
Well, I mean, if you think about the times we've been living through after the financial crisis of 2008, we lived through almost 15 years of record low interest rates. In fact, in real terms, after inflation, they were negative. That's what allowed, the venture capitalist firms to throw money at ventures that did not make any money, and some went public and still haven't had a positive bottom line because of that lower cost of capital. Those days are gone. Obviously they're gone. And when interest rates go up, when cost of capital goes up, you do have to worry about the alignment issue that you mentioned. And the reason, and let me just say, the current last few months, the uncertainty, and I mean the radical uncertainty surrounding tariffs, surrounding the decision makers. Do they really know what they're doing? All of that lengthens selling cycles. Interest rates up, cost of capital goes up, time to cash is later. That puts a lot more pressure, not only on lead generation, but lead qualification. You've got to identify false positives sooner rather than later. And any false positive has to be one that doesn't align with your strategy, assuming you have a strategy. That's what I was trying to get at. That's why it is it's always important, obviously, but it's very important in the current environment.
Yeah, it's in grad school. It's about the only thing I remember from economics, Frank, is the macroeconomic shifts that are driving the micro execution that we're doing at the deal level. And I loved when you talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So when you wrote Aligning Strategy with Sales, what was your motivation? What were you seeing? What problem needed to be solved? What pushed you to write that book?
Well, I mean, basically two motivations. I mean, since the time I started in academia, my area of research publication was distribution channels. That inevitably gets you interested in sales. But after 10 years in academia, I left with some others. We started a business. And as I'm sure you've discovered, Brian, once you've got to meet payroll every month, that increases your respect for sales. So that
Yeah.
was motivation number one. I get lucky in business. We sell. I go back to Harvard Business School and I simply saw a gap. There are many, many books and articles about strategy. It's not like the world is breathlessly waiting for yet another book about strategy. And there are also many, many books and articles about selling.
Yeah.
But if you look at the link that you and I are talking about, there's virtually nothing there. The
Yes. Yes.
strategy books talk as though sales doesn't exist, and the sales books basically talk at the level of the individual salesperson making a pitch, not
Mm.
linking it to what drives enterprise value. So, those were my motivations. One is in the real world, I saw how important it is. And secondly, like a good academic, you figure out where the gap is and you try to fill it with good empirically based research.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the things I liked about it is the strategic and tactical thought simultaneously. And I agree with you. And maybe that's the reason before I met you that this book resonated so strongly with me. You mentioned in the book that a really simple definition, and tell me if I got this wrong. Strategy is kind of where we want to go, and tactics are how we get there. You also mentioned that salespeople often sell what's easiest and not strategic. Why do you think it's so hard to get that behavior change to execute that strategy at the deal level?
Well, I mean, a couple of reasons. One is sales is a performance art. All right. I mean, that's the bottom line. And that means it's about behaviors. It's not simply about attitude, although that helps. It's not about dress for success, although depending on the sales context, that can help. But at the end of the day, selling is about what people say or don't say, what they
Yes.
do or don't do. And behavioral change, we know from lots and lots of great research for decades, is different than the classroom, right? Knowledge acquisition and behavioral change are linked, but they are not the same thing. And behavioral change is tougher. So that's one reason. The other is, and I find that executives, in effect, sometimes ignore this basic fact about their companies. We've got to step back every so often and remember in virtually all companies how important the go to market sales channel is. So many other organizational decisions depend on sales forecasts and the ability of whoever's selling to actually make those revenue forecasts, hiring decisions, capacity decisions in operations, etc. As a result, the pressure on sales is always make your numbers, right? And the metrics reinforce that. Make your numbers quarterly, monthly, sometimes even weekly. As a result, change is especially difficult in sales and marketing. Now, sales and marketing people always talk a good game about innovation and change.
Yeah.
They talk hip, they dress cool, but there's a lot of inertia there because of the metrics and the pressure. They tend to stick with the devil they know. That's how companies get disrupted. But it's not because of their genetic makeup, Brian. It's because frankly, how important they are in the organization. And ironically, that predictability expectation does not exactly lead to change and innovation.
Yeah. I wonder, Frank, as I have this discussion with people, there's two areas I want to ask you about. One is, I'm wondering your reaction to this. I feel like this notion of a rep's job now is not selling stuff. It's solving customer problems, of course. It's always that. But it's executing strategy. Like to me, this elevates the role of the rep to say, your job, here's where we're going. And your job is to execute strategy now, execute company strategy. And I'm wondering how you feel about that. I feel like it elevates the role of the rep.
I agree with both things of what you're saying. This notion that somehow sales as problem solving is something we only discovered in the last 5 years. That's nonsense, right?
Right.
That's always been part of what good selling is. And I agree with you about sales and executing strategy. In most companies, you know the data from the book that you so kindly mentioned. In most companies, sales is by far, nothing else comes close, by far the most expensive lever of
Hmm.
strategy execution. So that's what they get paid for. But it's got to be a two-way street. At the end of the day, real knowledge is at the account level. It's what I
Yes.
tell my students. Markets in the history of business have never bought anything. Only customers buy. Value is created or destroyed out there in the marketplace with customers. And that local knowledge, to use the academic term, generally resides up here in the salesperson, not at
Yeah.
not with some guy or gal at headquarters looking at a spreadsheet. So it's got to be a two-way street. That I think is the leadership challenge and responsibility.
Yeah, I wonder how you feel about this. Again, this is kind of a follow up to the previous question that when I have this discussion with people, and I mentioned to you earlier, I have your book cover in every presentation I do to investors, to customers, because this is the problem we're solving for is executing your strategy. I find that I need to almost define this for people because I think as to the point you were making, there's a lack of thought even about this notion of linking these two so direct. And one of the ways I try to make it actionable for folks is saying, look, you've got a broad corporate strategy, might involve some M&A stuff. Sales has nothing to do with that. You've got a sales strategy or go to market strategy, and it's not even that whole thing. There are pieces of strategy that will not come alive until a human changes behavior at the deal level. Is there a better way? Because I feel like we need to net this out, right, to make it tangible for people.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that, and I think again, I think your phrase "deal level" is a way of not only making actionable but tangible what I said. Markets don't buy, only customers buy. That's
Yeah.
the deal level. The other thing I would say, and this is sort of a dirty fact about business that I think people ignore, there's a reason that you've got to educate smart, well educated executives about this. I had a colleague here at Harvard Business School, Julie Wolf. She did some great research. She looked at the C suite in the Global 1000 over the last 25 years. And what she found is that on average in these firms, the number of executives reporting to the CEO had doubled, twice
Hmm.
as many. But then if you ask yourself, who are these people? Where did they come from? What were they doing before they became senior executives? Actually, very few of them were general managers in the sense, Brian, in which you and I probably use that phrase. Someone running a
Hmm.
line of business with P&L responsibilities. Mainly they were specialists, right? The CIO, the CMO, legal, counsel, now data analytics or AI. They had never in their previous career had sustained contact with customers.
Yeah.
And that affects things when you're basically doing one of the things every C-level executive gets paid for, and that is putting together a market relevant strategy. That gap is wider now than it was 20 years ago. That's one of the reasons that I think you run into the need to educate smart people about something that I think you and I would say, duh, isn't this obvious? It is not that obvious to
Yeah.
these folks because of the previous 20 to 30 years of their lives.
Yeah, I was trying to sort of put some numbers associated with this problem of like what happens when you don't execute strategy at the deal level. And Frank, I don't know if these were your numbers, so I apologize, but I it's somewhere around, and tell me what you think of this, that like half of strategy ends up getting executed. I think maybe even been worse than that, and only 50% of the value promised in the strategy is ever delivered. How would you quantify the problem? Is it worse than that?
No, I think you've got it pretty close. The book Aligning Strategy and Sales at this point is almost a decade old, but the research in that book and the research I cite is very much in keeping with what you're saying. It is only a relatively small percentage of strategies that actually achieve the numbers that the executives say they're going to achieve. There's a heck of a lot of value that is left on the table. And if you look at why that is, at the end of the day, it's about our interactions with customers. I don't much care if we call that interaction sales or marketing or asparagus, but that's where value does or doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, I'll paraphrase here. The kind of strategic imperative. You've said, look, if we don't have that behavior change, this remains a vision on a PowerPoint deck in a boardroom.
Yeah.
And to me, that, and then you look at the impact of that, which is 50% of what we promise with our strategy is actually being delivered in terms of value. So in sales management that works, you talk about the role of frontline sales manager and executing strategy. Give me your perspective on that, if you would.
Well, they're crucial people in any organization because, to use the jargon, for better or worse, they have a multiplier effect, right?
Yeah.
They affect multiple salespeople dealing with yet another multiple of accounts. If they're good, the leverage on the upside is good. If they're bad, the leverage on the downside is bad. In most companies, that frontline manager is the key person for hiring salespeople, for allocating territories, leads, opportunities. They often determine compensation, incentives, and so forth. So, my advice to executives is when you got a good person in that position, you take care of them. Those are the people you want to nurture and keep. And when you got a bad one, make the change sooner rather than later.
Yeah, this is when we were building our company. We interviewed 65 C-level revenue sales execs and some sales enablement, revenue enablement types, and we heard over and over and over again, frontline managers just don't have time. I meet or speak with companies who say, well, we're going to train our frontline managers to coach, and it's like that's not the problem. The root cause is they don't have the time. I don't think they're going to find the time. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I think I in my career, and compare your experience with mine, Brian. I rarely meet the manager at almost any level, and especially in sales, who says, coaching, what a bunch of crap. I don't want to do it. I think they understand the importance of that, but it is a calendar issue. Now, let
Yeah,
me say this is an area where technology can help.
yeah, yeah,
This is an area where you can free up a lot of time through smart use of technology and AI. We don't have to wait, for the next iteration of these large language models. They already exist to the point where you can free up a lot of those admin tasks for managers and reps, and frankly, create more time for the highly impactful
yeah.
coaching and performance reviews.
Yeah, it's I rarely talk about my stuff on this show because I want to talk to you. But again, what we do is, and the way we view the world is so interlinked that I almost can't help but to do it. But that is what we're doing, and it's funny too because I showed a buddy of mine, Gary, who's a VP of sales at a tech company, kind of a deal summary of what a pre-guided deal looks like, and he said to me, Frank, holy blank, I could 3 to 5x the number of deals that I could coach against if I had this deal summary. And what he said further was, I spend 50% of my one-on-ones collecting the basic data. Is it qualified, which you pointed out earlier? Are we talking to the right people about the right things? Can we compete? All of that can be delivered to a frontline manager. And to Gary's point, I can 3 to 5x that thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's even more than that. I mean, if you ask yourself a basic question about sales, how much time does the average salesperson spend in actual customer contact? And by that, I don't just mean making a pitch,
Yeah.
either via Zoom or in person. I mean all forms of customer contact: email, demos, webinars. On average, it's about 30 to 35%. Now, if you can up that to 40, 45%, 50% or more, not only is that a huge productivity increase, what your friend is saying, wow, three to
Yeah.
five times, but in most businesses, better utilization there also increases the addressable market. In other words, segments that were uneconomic now become economically feasible. That's a major growth engine above and beyond the really significant productivity improvements.
Yeah. And yeah, I read a stat the other day that 5% of deals in the pipeline are touched in some way by a frontline manager. And but the evidence is there. Like, and I think you make the point. I think you use maybe 50% of pipe. I think that's about the right number. You don't want 100% of pipe guided or coached. You just want to get to the top. So the evidence is there that it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. But the only other thing I'd add, Brian, and again, I think, this is a calendar issue, but one of the things that's constantly surprised and, to be honest, dismayed me in working with companies over the years, doing performance reviews is a very trainable skill. Most of the time when we talk about leadership, I sometimes feel I left the business school and now I'm in the school of theology, spiritual discussions.
Yeah.
Performance reviews are a very, very trainable skill. And a lot of companies don't train their managers in doing that. And I think that's dumb
Yeah.
because so much of the really relevant deal information is not in the CRM system. That's
Yep.
notoriously noisy data. It's locked up here in the head of the account manager, and it only becomes visible and actionable when you do a good performance review.
Right. So I often, and we found this out in some primary research we just did, that there's a big differentiation between deal coaching versus skill coaching. You make a differentiation between coaching versus reporting. Tell me what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, coaching is about what, again, getting back to the core alignment issue we're discussing, it's about the behaviors that we need to add value to our enterprise, right? That's what a good strategy does in our market. Again, there's no such thing as performance in the abstract. There's only performance in our market with our product at our prices. That's what coaching is about.
Yeah.
The metrics are lagging indicators. The metrics are about stuff that already happened. And, one of the basic facts about business and humanity is you're not going to go back into the past. The
Yeah.
past is history, as the kids say. All decisions in business, all strategic decisions are about the future, not the past. That's what coaching is about.
Yeah. I feel like, sorry, you just made me think of something that makes this notion of executing strategy at the deal level even more important. Another one of my favorite books, Frank, alongside you, is Rita Hunter McGrath from Columbia, wrote a
Yep.
book entitled The End of Competitive Advantage, which is a very sad title for those of us who sell for a living. But I think the point that she made was we used to have annual planning. We had our structural advantage, and we'd leverage that structural advantage for for the next year. And what she says in the book, paraphrasing, is that everything's changing. Your value, competitors' value, customer needs are shifting. Maybe it's because of supply chain or some geopolitical issue. That we now need to learn to compete on a series of short-term transient advantages, which means our strategy is shifting almost real time. Frank, I spoke to an SVP of sales who said, I'm doing the equivalent of annual planning quarterly. And any one of those, including me, who's been a Fortune 50 VP, knows that annual planning usually shuts you down for a month. So I'm just wondering that speed of change. It's what my advisor Jim Dickey calls selling at the speed of change. And I'm wondering, like, how you think this speed of change makes this problem that you wrote about 10 years ago even more relevant today.
Well, I don't want to, sound like the typical academic on the one hand this, on the other hand that.
Yeah,
But on the one hand, I certainly agree about the importance of change. Again, it is
yeah,
not the responsibility of the market to adapt to any company's strategy. It's the responsibility of the company to adapt to the market. And if, in fact, what Rita and others are getting at is that call it what you want, product life cycles, market life cycles are accelerating, I would agree with that. There's data to support that. But change is perennial in business. When I started at Harvard Business School, one of the required readings in strategy was the autobiography of Alfred P. Sloan, the guy who turned around General Motors in the
yeah,
1920s. Read his chapter on change. If you substitute internet or AI for automobile, he's talking about changes that occurred over 2 to 3 years,
yes,
right? So change has always been there. Agility is important, but my problem with the folks that talk this way is that they come awfully close to saying because of the speed of change, therefore, when it comes to strategy, as they say in New York City, forget about it. And I think that's a big, big mistake, a
yes,
huge mistake. It is difficult to get good, sustained things done in business without a strategy. Now, does that mean our strategy is not going to last forever? And in fact, we've got to adapt it? Of course we
yeah, yeah,
do.
yeah,
But I think, this talk about change and therefore throw out this, throw out that, I don't agree with
yeah,
that.
yeah,
That
and
is a
but
mistake.
yeah, and I love what you were just saying. It's I think it's even more important now, but what's important is the way we think about strategy. It's not annual planning. That we need a strategy practically every quarter to say what shifted and what do we need to adjust, and then the
Yeah,
problem
but
you and I
but,
talk
but
about.
I'd go. I'd be even more blunt about this. And again, this is, I think, important to recognize. Strategy has never been about annual strategic planning,
Right.
ever.
Yeah.
Strategic planning in 99% of companies has nothing to do with strategy. It's deciding on the annual capital budget,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Strategic planning and strategic thinking are not the same thing. And strategic planning was always been something about the forms, etc. That's, I think, a basic confusion. And here I think good executives are smarter than the academics who point to that. Good executives know the difference between capital budgeting and the kinds of strategic choices and alignment issues that you and I are talking about.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. This. Oh, I opened up with this, and I'm going to close with this. I've been looking forward to chatting with you, and I've appreciated our conversations outside of this podcast. You've been unbelievably generous with your time and your ideas, and I know you're also getting over a many week long cold. So I appreciate you being here, and Frank, I think of this podcast as sort of a body of knowledge of this selling environment that we all live in, and I love that you added to it, like, so people can come here and think about this particular subject, which is something we haven't talked about. And I can't thank you enough for, again, your time and your ideas and being willing to come here and
Well,
share.
again, my pleasure. We'll do it again. We'll talk about, I don't know, pricing or hiring or something in addition that's relevant to the topic. My
Great.
best wishes.
Thank you, my friend.